Section 24 of Myths of Babylonia and Assyria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulais. Myths of Babylonia and Assyria by David Alexander Mackenzie. Chapter 19, Assyria's Age of Splendor, Part 2. Fortunately for Ahaz, he had a wise counselor at this time in the great statesman and prophet, the scholarly Isaiah. The Lord spake by Isaiah, saying, Go and loose the sackcloth from off thy loins, and put off thy shoe from thy foot. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot. And the Lord said, Like as my servant Isaiah hath walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and wonder upon Egypt and upon Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian prisoners. And they, the allies, shall be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia their expectation, and of Egypt their glory. Isaiah warned Ahaz against joining the league in the year that Tartan came upon Ashdod, when Sargon the king of Assyria sent him. The Tartan fought against Ashdod and took it. According to Sargon's record, the pretender of Ashdod fled to Arabia, where he was seized by an Arabian chief and delivered up to Assyria. The pro-Egyptian party in Palestine went under a cloud for a period thereafter. Before Sargon could deal with Merodach-Baladan of Babylon, he found it necessary to pursue the arduous task of breaking up a powerful league which had been formed against him in the north. The Syro-Cappadocian Hittite states, including Tabal in Asia Minor and Carchemish in North Syria, were combining for the last time against Assyria, supported by Midas, the king of the Muski Frisians, and Rusas, son of Sarduris III, king of Urartu. Urartu had recovered somewhat from the disasters which it had suffered at the hands of Tiglath-Pileser, and was winning back portions of its lost territory on the northeast frontier of Assyria. A buffer state had been formed in that area by Tiglath-Pileser, who had assisted the king of the Mannai to weld together the hill tribesmen between Lake Van and Lake Urmia into an organized nation. Iranzu, its leader, remained faithful to Assyria and consequently became involved in war with Rusas of Urartu, who either captured or won over several cities of the Mannai. Iranzu was succeeded by his son Azah, and this king was so pronounced a pro-Assyrian that his pro-Urartian subjects assassinated him and set on the throne Bagati of Umildish. Soon after Sargon began his operations in the north, he captured Bagati and had him skinned alive. The flag of revolt, however, was kept flying by his brother Ulusunu, but ere long this ambitious man found it prudent to submit to Sargon on condition that he would retain the throne as a faithful Assyrian vassal. His sudden change of policy appears to have been due to the steady advance of the Median tribes into the territory of the Mannai. Sargon conducted a vigorous and successful campaign against the raiders and extended Ulusunu's area of control. The way was now clear to Urartu. In 714 BC, Sargon attacked the revolting king of Zikirtu, who was supported by an army led by Rusas, his overlord. A fierce battle was fought in which the Assyrians achieved a great victory. King Rusas fled, and when he found that the Assyrians pressed home their triumph by laying waste the country before them, he committed suicide, according to the Assyrian records, although those of Urartu indicate that he subsequently took part in the struggle against Sargon. The Armenian peoples were compelled to acknowledge the suzerainty of Assyria, and the conqueror received gifts from various tribes between Lake Van and the Caspian Sea, and along the frontiers from Lake Van towards the southeast as far as the borders of Elam. Rusas of Urartu was succeeded by Argistes II, who reigned over the shrunken kingdom. He intrigued with neighboring states against Assyria, but was closely watched. Ere long he found himself caught between two fires. During his reign, The notorious Cimmerians and Scythians displayed much activity in the north and raided his territory. The pressure of fresh infusions of Thraco-Phrygian tribes into Western Asia Minor had stirred Midas of the Muski to cooperate with the Urartian power in an attempt to stamp out Assyrian influence in Cilicia, Cappadocia, and North Syria. A revolt in Tabal in 718 BC was extinguished by Sargon, but in the following year evidences were forthcoming of a more serious and widespread rising. Pisiris, king of Carchemish, threw off the Assyrian yoke. Before, however, his allies could hasten to his assistance, he was overcome by the vigilant Sargon, who deported a large portion of the city's inhabitants and incorporated it in an Assyrian province. Tabal revolted in 713 BC and was similarly dealt with. In 712 BC, Milid had to be overcome. The inhabitants were transported, and Suti Aramean peoples settled in their homes. The king of Commagene, having remained faithful, received large extensions of territory. Finally, in 709 BC, Midas of the Muski Phrygians was compelled to acknowledge the suzerainty of Assyria. The northern confederacy was thus completely worsted and broken up. The tribute was paid by many peoples, including the rulers of Cyprus. Sargon was now able to deal with Babylonia, which for about 12 years had been ruled by Merodach Baladan, who oppressed the peoples and set at defiance ancient laws by seizing private estates and transferring them to his Chaldean kinsmen. He still received the active support of Elam. Sargon's first move was to interpose his army between those of the Babylonians and Elamites. Pushing southward, he subdued the Arameans on the eastern banks of the Tigris and drove the Elamites into the mountains. Then he invaded Middle Babylonia from the east. Merodach Baladan hastily evacuated Babylon and, moving southward, succeeded in evading Sargon's army. Finding Elam was unable to help him, he took refuge in the Chaldean capital, Bit Jakin, in southern Babylonia. Sargon was visited by the priests of Babylon and Borsippa and hailed as the savior of the ancient kingdom. He was afterwards proclaimed king at East Sagilla, where he took the hands of Bel. Then, having expelled the Arameans from Sippar, he hastened southward, attacked Bit Jakin, and captured it. Merodach Baladan escaped into Elam. The whole of Chaldea was subdued. Thus Sargon the latter entered at length into full possession of the empire of Sargon of Akkad. In Babylonia he posed as an incarnation of his ancient namesake, and had similarly messianic pretensions, which were no doubt inspired by the Babylonian priesthood. Under him Assyria attained its highest degree of splendor. He recorded proudly not only his great conquests, but also his works of public utility. He restored ancient cities, irrigated vast tracts of country, fostered trade, and promoted the industries. Like the pious pharaohs of Egypt, he boasted that he fed the hungry and protected the weak against the strong. Sargon found time during his strenuous career as a conqueror to lay out and plan a new city, called Dur-Sharukin, the Burg of Sargon, to the north of Nineveh. It was completed before he undertook the Babylonian campaign. The new palace was occupied in 708 BC. Previously to that period, he had resided principally in Kalki, in the restored palace of Ashur-natsir-pal III. He was a worshipper of many gods. Although he claimed to have restored the supremacy of Ashur, which had come to an end, he not only adored Ashur, but also revived the ancient triad of Anu, Bel, and Ea, and fostered the growth of the immemorial mother cult of Ishtar. Before he died, he appointed one of his sons, Sennacherib, viceroy of the northern portion of the empire. He was either assassinated at a military review or in some frontier war. As much is suggested by the following entry in an eponym list. Eponymy of Upahir Balu, prefect of the city of Medu. According to the oracle of the Kulumites, a soldier entered the camp of the king of Assyria and killed him. Month Ab, day 12th, Sennacherib, sat on the throne. The fact that Sennacherib lamented his father's sins suggests that the old king had in some manner offended the priesthood. Perhaps, like some of the Middle Empire monarchs, he succumbed to the influence of Babylon during the closing years of his life. It is stated that he was not buried in his house, which suggests that the customary religious rites were denied him, and that his lost soul was supposed to be a wanderer which had to eat offal and drink impure water, like the ghost of a pauper or a criminal. The task which lay before Sennacherib, 705 to 680 BC, was to maintain the unity of the great empire of his distinguished father. He waged minor wars against the Kassite and Illipi tribes on the Elamite border, and the Muski and Hittite tribes in Cappadocia and Cilicia. The Kassites, however, were no longer of any importance, and their Hittite power had been extinguished, for ere the states could recover from the blows dealt by the Assyrians, the Sumerian hordes ravaged their territory. Urartu was also overrun by the fierce barbarians from the north. It was one of these last visits of the Assyrians to Tabal of the Hittites and the land of the Muski, Meshkek, which the Hebrew prophet referred to in aftertime when he exclaimed, "Ashur is there and all her company. His graves are about him, all of them slain, fallen by the sword. There is Meshech, Tubal, and all her multitude. Her graves are round about him, all of them uncircumcised, slain by the sword, though they caused their terror in the land of the living." Ezekiel 32. Sennacherib found that the Ionians had settled in Cilicia, and he deported large numbers of them to Nineveh. The metal and ivory work at Nineveh show traces of Greek influence after this period. A great conspiracy was fomented in several states against Sennacherib when the intelligence of Sargon's death was bruited abroad. Egypt was concerned in it. Taharka, the biblical Tirhakah, the last pharaoh of the Ethiopian dynasty, had dreams of re-establishing the Egyptian supremacy in Palestine and Syria, and leagued himself with Luli, king of Tyre, Hezekiah, king of Judah, and others. Merodach-Baladan, the Chaldean king, whom Sargon had deposed, supported by the Elamites and Arameans, was also a party to the conspiracy. At that time Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah was glad of them. Merodach-Baladan again seized the throne of Babylon. Sargon's son, who had been appointed governor, was murdered, and a pretender sat on the throne for a brief period. But Merodach-Baladan thrust him aside and reigned for 9 months, during which period he busied himself by encouraging the kings of Judah and Tyre to revolt. Sennacherib invaded Babylonia with a strong army, deposed Merodach-Baladan, routed the Chaldeans and Arameans, and appointed as vassal king Bel-Ibni, a native prince, who remained faithful to Assyria for about 3 years. In 707 BC, Sennacherib appeared in the west. When he approached Tyre, Luli, the king, fled to Cyprus. The city was not captured, but much of its territory was ceded to the king of Sidon. Ascalon was afterwards reduced. At Eltekeh, Sennacherib came into conflict with an army of allies, including Ethiopian, Egyptian, and Arabian Mutsri forces, which he routed. Then he captured a number of cities in Judah and transported 200,150 people. He was unable, however, to enter Jerusalem, in which Hezekiah was compelled to remain like a bird in a cage. It appears that Hezekiah bought off the Assyrians on this occasion with gifts of gold and silver and jewels, costly furniture, musicians, and female slaves. In 689 BC, Sennacherib found it necessary to penetrate Arabia. Apparently another conspiracy was brewing, for Hezekiah again revolted. On his return from the south, according to Berosus, he had been in Egypt. The Assyrian king marched against the king of Judah. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was come, and that he was proposed to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with the princes and his mighty men to stop the waters of the fountains which were without the city, and they did help him. Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water? Sennacherib sent messengers to Jerusalem to attempt to stir up the people against Hezekiah. He wrote also letters to rail on the Lord God of Israel, and to speak against him, saying, "As the gods of the nations of other lands have not delivered their people out of mine hand, so shall not the God of Hezekiah deliver his people out of mine hand." Hezekiah sent his servants to Isaiah, who was in Jerusalem at the time, and the prophet said to them, "Thus shall ye say to your master, Thus saith the Lord, Be not afraid of the words which thou hast heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I shall send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor, and shall return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." According to Berosus, the Babylonian priestly historian, the camp of Sennacherib was visited in the night by swarms of field mice, which ate up the quivers and bows and the leather handles of shields. Next morning the army fled. The biblical account of the disaster is as follows: "And it came to pass that night, that the angel of the Lord went out, and smote the camp of the Assyrians 180,500. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib king of Assyria departed, and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh." The pestilence may have broken out in the camp, the infection, perhaps, having been carried by field mice. Byron's imagination was stirred by the vision of the broken army of Assyria. "The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming with purple and gold, and the sheen of their shields was like stars of the sea, when the blue wave rolls nightly on the deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset was seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, that host on the morrow lay withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed on the face of the foe as he passed. And the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved, and forever grew still. And there lay the steed with his nostrils all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride, and the foam of his gasping lay white on the turf, and cold as the spray of the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow and the rust on his mail. And the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances uplifted, the trumpet unblown. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broken in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord." Before this disaster occurred, Sennacherib had to invade Babylonia again, for the vassal king, Bel-ibni, had allied himself with the Chaldeans and raised the standard of revolt. The city of Babylon was besieged and captured, and its unfaithful king deported with a number of nobles to Assyria. Old Merodach Baladan was concerned in the plot and took refuge on the Elamite coast, where the Chaldeans had formed a colony. He died soon afterwards. Sennacherib operated in southern Babylonia and invaded Elam. But ere he could return to Assyria, he was opposed by a strong army of allies, including Babylonians, Chaldeans, Arameans, Elamites, and Persians, led by Samunu, the son of Merodach Baladan. A desperate battle was fought. Although Sennacherib claimed a victory, he was unable to follow it up. This was in 692 BC. A Chaldean named Mushezib-Merodach seized the Babylonian throne. In 691 BC, Sennacherib again struck a blow for Babylonia, but was unable to depose Mushezib-Merodach. His opportunity came, however, in 689 BC. Elam had been crippled by raids of the men of Parsua, Persia, and was unable to cooperate with the Chaldean king of Babylon. Sennacherib captured the great commercial metropolis, took Mushezib-Merodach prisoner, and dispatched him to Nineveh. Then he wreaked his vengeance on Babylon. For several days the Assyrian soldiers looted the houses and temples, and slaughtered the inhabitants without mercy. Isigla was robbed of its treasures. Images of deities were either broken in pieces or sent to Nineveh. The statue of Bel Merodach was dispatched to Ashur so that he might take his place among the gods who were vassals of Ashur. The city and its houses, Sennacherib records, from foundation to roof, I destroyed them, I demolished them, I burned them with fire. Walls, gateways, sacred chapels, and the towers of earth and tiles, I laid them low and cast them into the Araktu. So thoroughly was Sennacherib's destruction of the city in 689 BC, writes Mr. King, that after several years of work, Dr. Koldewey concluded that all traces of earlier buildings had been destroyed on that occasion. More recently, some remains of earlier strata have been recognized, and contract tablets have been found which date from the period of the First Dynasty. Moreover, a number of earlier pot burials have been unearthed, but a careful examination of the greater part of the ruins has added little to our knowledge of this most famous city before the Neo-Babylonian period. It is possible that Sennacherib desired to supplant Babylon as a commercial metropolis by Nineveh. He extended and fortified that city, surrounding it with two walls protected by moats. According to Diodorus, the walls were 100 feet high and about 50 feet wide. Excavators have found that at the gates they were about 100 feet in breadth. The water supply of the city was ensured by the construction of dams and canals, and strong quays were erected to prevent flooding. Sennacherib repaired a lofty platform which was isolated by a canal, and erected upon it his great palace. On another platform he had an arsenal built. Sennacherib's palace was the most magnificent building of its kind ever erected by an Assyrian emperor. It was lavishly decorated, and its bas-reliefs displayed native art at its highest pitch of excellence. The literary remains of the time also give indication of the growth of culture. The inscriptions are distinguished by their prose style. It is evident that men of culture and refinement were numerous in Assyria. The royal library of Kalki received many additions during the reign of the destroyer of Babylon. Like his father, Sennacherib died a violent death. According to the Babylonian Chronicle, he was slain in a revolt by his son on the 20th day of Tebet, 680 BC. The revolt continued from the 20th of Tebet, early in January, until the 2nd day of Adar, the middle of February. On the 18th of Adar, Esarhaddon, the son of Sennacherib, was proclaimed king. Berosus states that Sennacherib was murdered by two of his sons, but Esarhaddon was not one of the conspirators. The biblical reference is as follows: Sennacherib dwelt at Nineveh, and it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch, Ashar, his god, that Adremelech and Sherezer, Ashur-shar-etir, his son, smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia, Urartu, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. Ashur-shar-etir appears to have been the claimant to the throne. Esarhaddon, 680 668 BC, was a man of different type from his father. He adopted towards vassal states a policy of conciliation, and did much to secure peace within the empire by his magnanimous treatment of rebel kings who had been intimidated by their neighbors and forced to entwine themselves in the meshes of intrigue. His wars are directed mainly to secure the protection of outlying provinces against aggressive raiders. The monarch was strongly influenced by his mother, Naki'a, a Babylonian princess who appears to have been as distinguished a lady as the famous Sammu Rammat. Indeed, it is possible that traditions regarding her contributed to the Semiramis legends, but it was not only due to her that Esarhaddon espoused the cause of the pro-Babylonian party. He appears to be identical with the Axerdes of Berosus, who ruled over the southern kingdom for 8 years. Apparently he had been appointed governor by Sennacherib after the destruction of Babylon, and it may be that during his term of office in Babylonia he was attracted by its ethical ideals, and developed those traits of character which distinguished him from his father and grandfather. He married a Babylonian princess, and one of his sons, Shamash-shum-ukin, was born in a Babylonian palace, probably at Sippar. He was a worshipper of the mother goddess Ishtar of Nineveh, and Ishtar of Arabella, and of Shamash, as well as of the national god Ashur. As soon as Esarhaddon came to the throne he undertook the restoration of Babylon, to which many of the inhabitants were drifting back. In 3 years the city resumed its preeminent position as a trading and industrial center. Withal, he won the hearts of the natives by expelling the Chaldeans from the private estates which they had seized during the Merodach-Baladan regime, and restoring them to the rightful heirs. The Chaldean revolt was inevitable. 2 of Merodach-Baladan's sons gave trouble in the south, but were routed in battle. One fled to Elam, where he was assassinated, the other sued for peace, and was accepted by the diplomatic Esarhaddon as a vassal king. Egypt was intriguing in the west. Its Ethiopian king, Taharka, the biblical Tirhakah, had stirred up Hezekiah to revolt during Sennacherib's reign. An Assyrian ambassador who had visited Jerusalem heard say concerning Tirhakah, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, "Let not thy God, in whom thou trustest, deceive thee, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Behold, thou hast heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands by destroying them utterly, and shalt thou be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them which my fathers have destroyed, as Gozan and Haran and Rezeph and the children of Eden, which were in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath, and the king of Arphad, and the king of the city of Sepharvaim, Hena and Iva?" Sidon was a party to the pro-Egyptian league which had been formed in Palestine and Syria. Early in his reign, Esarhaddon conducted military operations in the west, and during his absence the queen mother, Naki'a, held the reins of government. The Elamites regarded this innovation as a sign of weakness and invaded Babylon. Sippar was plundered and its gods carried away. The Assyrian governors, however, ultimately repulsed the Elamite king, who was deposed soon after he returned home. His son, who succeeded him, restored the stolen gods, and cultivated good relations with Esarhaddon. There was great unrest in Elam at this period. It suffered greatly from the inroads of Median and Persian pastoral fighting folk. In the north, the Cimmerians and Scythians, who were constantly warring against Urartu and against each other, had spread themselves westward and east. Esarhaddon drove Sumerian invaders out of Cappadocia, and they swamped Phrygia. The Scythian peril on the northeast frontier was, however, of more pronounced character. The fierce mountaineers had allied themselves with Median tribes and overrun the buffer state of the Mannai. Both Urartu and Assyria were sufferers from the brandage of these allies. Esarhaddon's generals, however, were able to deal with the situation, and one of the notable results of the pacification of the northeast area was the conclusion of an alliance with Urartu. The most serious situation with which the emperor had to deal was in the west. The king of Sidon, who had been so greatly favored by Sennacherib, had espoused the Egyptian cause. He allied himself with the king of Cilicia, who, however, was unable to help him. Sidon was besieged and captured. The royal allies escaped, but a few years later were caught and beheaded. The famous seaport was destroyed, and its vast treasures deported to Assyria, about 676 BC. Esarhaddon replaced it by a new city called Kar-Esarhaddon, which formed the nucleus of the new Sidon. It is believed that Judah and other disaffected states were dealt with about this time. Manasseh succeeded Hezekiah at Jerusalem when but a boy of 12 years. He appears to have come under the influence of heathen teachers. For he built up again the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he reared up altars for Baal, and made a grove, as did Ahab king of Israel, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of the Lord. And he made his son pass through the fire, and observed times, and used enchantments, and dealt with familiar spirits and wizards. He wrought much wickedness in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger. and he set a graven image of the grove that he had made in the house, of which the Lord said to David and to Solomon his son, In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, will I put my name forever. Isaiah ceased to prophesy after Manasseh came to the throne. According to the rabbinic traditions, he was seized by his enemies and enclosed in the hollow trunk of a tree, which was sawn through. Other Orthodox teachers appear to have been slain also. Manasseh shed innocent blood very much, till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another. It is possible that there is a reference to Isaiah's fate in an early Christian lament regarding the persecutions of the faithful. Others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. There is no Assyrian evidence regarding the captivity of Manasseh. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the people of Judah, the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns, and bound him with fetters, and carried him to Babylon. And when he was in affliction, he besought the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers, and prayed unto him. And he was entreated of him, and heard his supplication, and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. It was, however, in keeping with the policy of Esarhaddon to deal in this manner with an erring vassal. The Assyrian records include Manasseh of Judah, Manasseh of the city of Yaudu, with the kings of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, Ashdod, Gaza, Byblos, etc., and 22 kings of Kati, as payers of tribute to Esarhaddon, their overlord. Hazael of Arabia was conciliated by having restored to him his gods which Sennacherib had carried away. Egypt continued to intrigue against Assyria, and Esarhaddon resolved to deal effectively with Taharka, the last Ethiopian pharaoh. In 674 BC, he invaded Egypt, but suffered a reverse and had to retreat. Tyre revolted soon afterwards, 673 BC. Esarhaddon, however, made elaborate preparations for his next campaign. In 671 BC, he went westward with a much more powerful army. A detachment advanced to Tyre and invested it. The main force meanwhile pushed on, crossed the Delta frontier, and swept victoriously as far south as Memphis, where Taharka suffered a crushing defeat. That great Egyptian metropolis was then occupied and plundered by the soldiers of Esarhaddon. Lower Egypt became an Assyrian province. The various petty kings, including Necho of Sais, had set over them Assyrian governors. Tyre was also captured. When he returned home, Esarhaddon erected at the Syro-Cappadocian city of Singirli a statue of victory, which is now in the Berlin Museum. On this memorial, the Assyrian king of the kings of Egypt is depicted as a giant. With one hand he pours out an oblation to a god. In the other, he grasps his scepter and two cords attached to rings, which pierce the lips of dwarfish figures representing the pharaoh Taharka of Egypt and the unfaithful king of Tyre. In 668 BC, Taharka, who had fled to Napata in Ethiopia, returned to Upper Egypt and began to stir up revolts. Esarhaddon planned out another expedition so that he might shatter the last vestige of power possessed by his rival. But before he left home, he found it necessary to set his kingdom in order. During his absence from home, the old Assyrian party, who disliked the emperor because of Babylonian sympathies, had been intriguing regarding the succession of the throne. According to the Babylonian Chronicle, the king remained in Assyria during 669 BC, and he slew with the sword many noble men. Ashur-bani-pal was evidently concerned in the conspiracy, and it is significant to find that he pleaded on behalf of certain of the conspirators. The crown prince, Sinadinabal, was dead. Perhaps he had been assassinated. At the feast of the goddess Gula, identical with Bau, consort of Ninip, towards the end of April in 668 BC, Esarhaddon divided his kingdom between his two sons. Ashurbanipal was selected to be king of Assyria, and Shamash-shum-ukin to be the king of Babylon and the vassal of Ashurbanipal. Other sons received important priestly appointments. Soon after these arrangements were completed, Esarhaddon, who was suffering from bad health, set out for Egypt. He died towards the end of October, and the early incidents of his campaign were included in the record of Ashurbanipal's reign. Taharka was defeated at Memphis and retreated southward to Thebes. So passed away the man who has been eulogized as the noblest and most sympathetic figure among the Assyrian kings. There was certainly much which was attractive to his character. He inaugurated many social reforms, and appears to have held in check his overbearing nobles. Trade flourished during his reign. He did not undertake the erection of a new city, like his father, but won the gratitude of the priesthood by his activities as a builder and restorer of temples. He founded a new "House of Ashur" at Nineveh, and reconstructed several temples in Babylonia. His son Ashur-bani-pal was the last great Assyrian ruler. End of chapter 19, part 2.
Chapter 20 of Myths of Babylonia and Assyria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leda Blair. Myths of Babylonia and Assyria by Alexander Mackenzie. Chapter 20. The burden of Nineveh. The Lord is slow to anger, and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. The Lord hath his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebuketh the sea, and maketh it dry, and drieth up all the rivers. Bashan languisheth, and Carmel, and the flower of Lebanon languisheth. He that dasheth in pieces is come up before thy face. The gates of the rivers shall be opened, and the palace shall be dissolved. And Huzab shall be led away captive. She shall be brought up, and her maids shall lead her as with the voice of doves, tabering upon their breasts. Draw thee waters for the siege, fortify thy strongholds. Go into clay and tread the mortar, make strong the brick-kiln. There shall the fire devour thee, the sword shall cut thee off. Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathereth them. There is no healing of thy bruise, thy wound is grievous. All that hear the bruit of thee shall clap the hands over thee. For upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually? The doom of Babylon was also foretold. Bel boweth down, Nebo stoopeth. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon, sit on the ground. There is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans. Stand now with thine enchantments, and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast laboured from thy youth. If so be thou shalt be able to profit, if so be thou mayest prevail. Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up, and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. Behold, they shall be as stubble, the fire shall burn them. Thus shall they be unto thee with whom thou hast laboured, even thy merchants from thy youth. They shall wander every one to his quarter, none shall save thee. Against a gloomy background, dark and ominous as a thundercloud, we have revealed in the last century of Mesopotamian glory the splendor of Assyria and the beauty of Babylon. The ancient civilizations ripened quickly before the end came. Kings still revelled in pomp and luxury. Cities resounded with the noise of a whip, and the noise of the rattling of the wheels, and of the prancing horses, and of the jumping chariots. The horsemen lifted up both the bright sword and the glittering spear. The valiant men are in scarlet. But the minds of cultured men were more deeply occupied than ever with the mysteries of life and creation. In the libraries, the temples and observatories, philosophers and scientists were shattering the unsubstantial fabric of immemorial superstition. They attained to higher conceptions of the duties and responsibilities of mankind. They conceived of divine love and divine guidance. They discovered, like Wordsworth, that the soul has an obscure sense of possible sublimity, whereto with growing faculties she doth aspire. One of the last kings of Babylon, Nebuchadrezzar, recorded a prayer which reveals the loftiness of religious thought and feelings attained by men to whom graven images were no longer worthy of adoration and reverence, men whose God was not made by human hands. O eternal Prince, Lord of all being, as for the king whom thou lovest, and whose name thou hast proclaimed as was pleasing to thee, do thou lead aright his life, guide him in a straight path. I am the prince, obedient to thee, the creature of thy hand. Thou hast created me, and with dominion over all people thou hast entrusted me, according to thy grace, O Lord, which thou dost bestow on all people. Cause me to love thy supreme dominion, and create in my heart the worship of thy Godhead, and grant whatever is pleasing to thee, because thou hast fashioned my life. The stargazers had become scientists, and foretold eclipses. In every sphere of intellectual activity, great men were sifting out truth from the debris of superstition. It seemed as if Babylon and Assyria were about to cross the threshold of a new age, when their doom was sounded, and their power was shattered forever. Nineveh perished with dramatic suddenness. Babylon died of senile decay. When, in 668 B.C., intelligence reached Nineveh that Esarhaddon had passed away, on the march through Egypt, the arrangements which he had made for the succession were carried out smoothly and quickly. Naki'a, the queen mother, was acting as regent, and completed her life work by issuing a proclamation exhorting all loyal subjects and vassals to obey the new rulers, her grandsons, Ashurbanipal, emperor of Assyria, and Shamash-shumukin, king of Babylon. Peace prevailed in the capital, and there was little or no friction throughout the provinces. New rulers were appointed to administer the states of Arvad and Ammon, but there were no changes elsewhere. Babylon welcomed its new king, a Babylonian by birth and the son of a Babylonian princess. The ancient kingdom rejoiced that it was no longer to be ruled as a province. Its ancient dignities and privileges were being partially restored. But one great and deep-seated grievance remained. The god Merodach was still a captive in the temple of Ashur. No king could reign aright if Merodach were not restored to Esagila. Indeed, he could not be regarded as the lord of the land until he had taken the hands of Bel. The ceremony of taking the god's hands was an act of homage. When it was consummated, the king became the steward or vassal of Merodach, and every day he appeared before the Divine One to receive instructions and worship him. The welfare of the whole kingdom depended on the manner in which the king acted towards the god. If Merodach was satisfied with the king, he sent blessings to the land. If he was angry, he sent calamities. A pious and faithful monarch was therefore the protector of the people. This close association of the king with the god gave the priests great influence in Babylon. They were the power behind the throne. The destinies of the royal house were placed in their hands. They could strengthen the position of a royal monarch, or cause him to be deposed if he did not satisfy their demands. A king who reigned over Babylon without the priestly party on his side occupied an insecure position. Nor could he secure the cooperation of the priests unless the image of the god was placed in the temple. Where king was, there Merodach had to be also. Shamash-shumukin pleaded with his royal brother and overlord to restore Bel-Merodach to Babylon. Ashurbanipal hesitated for a time. He was unwilling to occupy a less dignified position as the representative of Ashur than his distinguished predecessor, in his relation to the southern kingdom. At length, however, he was prevailed upon to consult the oracle of Shamash, the solar lawgiver, the revealer of destiny. The god was accordingly asked if Shamash-shumukin could take the hands of Bel in Ashur's temple, and then proceed to Babylon as his representative. In response, the priests of Shamash informed the emperor that Bel-Merodach could not exercise sway as sovereign lord so long as he remained a prisoner in a city which was not his own. Ashurbanipal accepted the verdict and then visited Ashur's temple to plead with Bel-Merodach to return to Babylon. "Let thy thoughts," he cried, "dwell in Babylon, which in thy wrath thou didst bring to naught. Let thy face be turned towards Sagila, thy lofty and divine temple. Return to the city thou hast deserted for a house unworthy of thee, O Merodach. Lord of the gods, issue thou the command to return again to Babylon." Thus did Ashurbanipal make pious and dignified submission to the will of the priests. A favourable response was, of course, received from Merodach when addressed by the emperor, and the god's image was carried back to Esagila, accompanied by a strong force. Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shumukin led the procession of priests and soldiers, and elaborate ceremonials were observed at each city they passed, the local gods being carried forth to do homage to Merodach. Babylon welcomed the deity who was thus restored to his temple after the lapse of about a quarter of a century, and the priests celebrated with unconcealed satisfaction and pride the ceremony at which Shamash-shumukin took the hands of Bel. The public rejoicings were conducted on an elaborate scale. Babylon believed that a new era of prosperity had been inaugurated, and the priests and nobles looked forward to the day when the kingdom would once again become free and independent and powerful. Ashurbanipal, 668 to 626 BC, made arrangements to complete his father's designs regarding Egypt. His Tartan continued the campaign, and Taharka, as has been stated, was driven from Memphis. The beaten pharaoh returned to Ethiopia and did not again attempt to expel the Assyrians. He died in 666 BC. It was found that some of the petty kings of Lower Egypt had been intriguing with Taharka, and their cities were severely dealt with. Necho of Sais had to be arrested, among others, but was pardoned after he appeared before Ashurbanipal and sent back to Egypt as the Assyrian governor. Tanutaman, son of Pharaoh Shabaka, succeeded Taharka, and in 663 BC marched northward from Thebes with a strong army. He captured Memphis. It is believed Necho was slain, and Herodotus relates that his son Psamtik took refuge in Syria. In 661 BC, Ashurbanipal's army swept through Lower Egypt and expelled the Ethiopians. Tanutaman fled southward, but on this occasion the Assyrians followed up their success and besieged and captured Thebes, which they sacked. Its nobles were slain or taken captive. According to the prophet Nahum, who refers to Thebes as Nu Ammon equals city of Ammon, her young children also were dashed in pieces at the top of all the streets, and they, the Assyrians, cast lots for her honourable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. Thebes never again recovered its prestige. Its treasures were transported to Nineveh. The Ethiopian supremacy in Egypt was finally extinguished, and Psamtik, son of Necho, who was appointed the pharaoh, began to reign as the vassal of Assyria. When the kings on the sea-coasts of Palestine and Asia Minor found that they could no longer look to Egypt for help, they resigned themselves to the inevitable, and ceased to intrigue against Assyria. Gifts were sent to Ashurbanipal by the kings of Arvad, Tyre, Tarsus, and Tabal. The Arvad ruler, however, was displaced, and his son set on his throne. But the most extraordinary development was the visit to Nineveh of emissaries from Gyges, king of Lydia, who figures in the legends of Greece. This monarch had been harassed by the Cimmerians after they accomplished the fall of Midas of Phrygia in 676 B.C., and he sought the help of Ashurbanipal. It is not known whether the Assyrians operated against the Cimmerians in Tabal, but as Gyges did not send tribute, it would appear that he held his own with the aid of mercenaries from the state of Caria in southwestern Asia Minor. The Greeks of Cilicia and the Achaeans and the Phoenicians of Cyprus remained faithful to Assyria. Elam gave trouble in 665 B.C. by raiding Akkad, but the Assyrian army repulsed the invaders at Duralu and pushed on to Susa. The Elamites received a crushing defeat in a battle on the banks of the river Ula. King Teuman was slain, and a son of the king of Urtagu was placed on his throne. Elam thus came under Assyrian sway. The most surprising and sensational conspiracy against Ashurbanipal was fomented by his brother Shamash-shum-ukin of Babylon, after the two had cooperated peacefully for 15 years. No doubt the priestly party at Esagila were deeply concerned in the movement, and the king may have been strongly influenced by the fact that Babylonia was at the time suffering from severe depression caused by a series of poor harvests. Merodach, according to the priests, was angry. It was probably argued that he was punishing the people because they had not thrown off the yoke of Assyria. The temple treasures of Babylon were freely drawn upon to purchase the allegiance of allies. Ere Ashurbanipal had any knowledge of the conspiracy his brother had won over several governors in Babylonia, the Chaldeans, Aramaeans, and Elamites, and many petty kings in Palestine and Syria. Even Egypt and Libya were prepared to help him. When, however, the faithful governor of was approached, he communicated with his superior at Erech, who promptly informed Ashurbanipal of the great conspiracy. The intelligence reached Nineveh like a bolt from the blue. The emperor's heart was filled with sorrow and anguish. In aftertime he lamented in an inscription that his faithless brother forgot the favours he had shown him. Outwardly, with his lips, he spoke friendly things, while inwardly his heart plotted murder. In 652 B.C., Shamash-shum-ukin precipitated the crisis by forbidding Ashurbanipal to make offerings to the gods in the cities of Babylonia. He thus declared his independence. War broke out simultaneously. And Erech was besieged and captured by the Chaldeans, and an Elamite army marched to the aid of the king of Babylon, but it was withdrawn before long on account of the unsettled political conditions at home. The Assyrian armies swept through Babylonia, and the Chaldeans in the south were completely subjugated before Babylon was captured. That great commercial metropolis was closely besieged for 3 years, and was starved into submission. When the Assyrians were entering the city gates, a sensational happening occurred. Shamash-shum-ukin, the rebel king, shut himself up in his palace and set fire to it, and perished there amidst the flames with his wife and children, his slaves, and all his treasures. Ashurbanipal was in 647 B.C. proclaimed King Kandalanu of Babylon and reigned over it until his death in 626 B.C. Elam was severely dealt with. That unhappy country was terribly devastated by Assyrian troops, who besieged and captured Susa, which was pillaged and wrecked. It was recorded afterwards as a great triumph of this campaign that the statue of Nana of Erech, which had been carried off by Elamites 1635 years previously, was recovered and restored to the ancient Sumerian city. Elam's power of resistance was finally extinguished, and the country fell a ready prey to the Medes and Persians, who soon entered into possession of it. Thus, by destroying a buffer state, Ashurbanipal strengthened the hands of the people who were destined 20 years after his death to destroy the empire of Assyria. The western allies of Babylon were also dealt with, and it may be that at this time Manasseh of Judah was taken to Babylon, where, however, he was forgiven. The Medes and the Mannai in the northwest were visited and subdued, and a new alliance was formed with the dying state of Urartu. Psamtik of Egypt had thrown off the yoke of Assyria, and with the assistance of Carian mercenaries received from his ally Gyges, king of Lydia, extended his sway southward. He made peace with Ethiopia by marrying a princess of its royal line. Gyges must have weakened his army by thus assisting Psamtik, for he was severely defeated and slain by the Cimmerians. His son Ardys appealed to Assyria for help. Ashurbanipal dispatched an army to Cilicia. The joint operations of Assyria and Lydia resulted in the extinction of the kingdom of the Cimmerians about 645 BC. The records of Ashurbanipal cease after 640 BC, so that we are unable to follow the events of his reign during its last 14 years. Apparently peace prevailed everywhere. The great monarch, who was a pronounced adherent of the goddess cults, appears to have given himself up to a life of indulgence and inactivity. Under the name Sardanapalus, he went down to tradition as a sensual Oriental monarch who lived in great pomp and luxury, and perished in his burning palace when the Medes revolted against him. It is evident, however, that the memory of more than one monarch contributed to the Sardanapalus legend, for Ashurbanipal had lain nearly 20 years in his grave before the siege of Nineveh took place. In the Bible he is referred to as the great and noble Asnapper, and he appears to have been the emperor who settled the Babylonian, Elamite, and other colonists in the cities of Samaria. He erected at Nineveh a magnificent palace, which was decorated on a lavish scale. The sculptures are the finest productions of Assyrian art, and embrace a wide variety of subjects: battle scenes, hunting scenes, and elaborate court and temple ceremonies. Realism is combined with a delicacy of touch and a degree of originality which raises the artistic productions of the period to the front rank among the artistic triumphs of antiquity. Ashurbanipal boasted of the thorough education which he had received from the tutors of his illustrious father Esarhaddon. In his palace he kept a magnificent library. It contained thousands of clay tablets on which were inscribed and translated the classics of Babylonia. To the scholarly zeal of this cultured monarch is due to the preservation of the Babylonian story of creation, the Gilgamesh and Etana legends, and other literary and religious products of remote antiquity. Most of the literary tablets in the British Museum were taken from Ashurbanipal's library. There are no Assyrian records of the reigns of Ashurbanipal's two sons, Ashur-etil-ilani, who erected a small palace and reconstructed the temple to Nebo at Kalki, and Sin-sharishkun, who is supposed to have perished in Nineveh. Apparently, Ashur-etil-ilani reigned for at least 6 years, and was succeeded by his brother. A year after Ashurbanipal died, Nabopolassar, who was probably a Chaldean, was proclaimed king at Babylon. According to Babylonian legend, he was an Assyrian general who had been sent southward with an army to oppose the advance of invaders from the sea. Nabopolassar's sway at first was confined to Babylon and Borsippa, but he strengthened himself by forming an offensive and defensive alliance with the Median king, whose daughter he had married to his son Nebuchadrezzar. He strengthened the fortifications of Babylon, rebuilt the temple of Merodach, which had been destroyed by Ashurbanipal, and waged war successfully against the Assyrians and their allies in Mesopotamia. About 606 B.C. Nineveh fell, and Shin-Shar-ishkun may have burned himself there in his palace, like his uncle Shamash-shum-ukin of Babylon and the legendary Sardanapalus. It is not certain, however, whether the Scythians or the Medes were the successful besiegers of the great Assyrian capital. "Woe to the bloody city! It is all full of lies and robbery," Nahum had cried. "The gates of the rivers shall be opened, and the palace shall be dissolved. Take ye the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold. Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts." According to Herodotus, an army of Medes under Cyaxares had defeated the Assyrians and were besieging Nineveh when the Scythians overran Media. Cyaxares raised the siege and went against them, but was defeated. Then the Scythians swept across Assyria and Mesopotamia and penetrated to the delta frontier of Egypt. Psamtik ransomed his kingdom with handsome gifts. At length, however, Cyaxares had the Scythian leaders slain at a banquet, and then besieged and captured Nineveh. Assyria was completely overthrown. Those of its nobles and priests who escaped the sword no doubt escaped to Babylonia. Some may have found refuge also in Palestine and Egypt. Necho, the second pharaoh of the 26th Egyptian dynasty, did not hesitate to take advantage of Assyria's fall. In 609 B.C. he proceeded to recover the long-lost Asiatic possessions of Egypt, and operated with an army and fleet. Gaza and Ascalon were captured. Josiah, the grandson of Manasseh, was king of Judah. In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up against the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went against him, and he, Necho, slew him at Megiddo. His son Jehoahaz succeeded him, but was deposed 3 months later by Necho, who placed another son of Josiah, named Eliakim, on the throne, and turned his name to Jehoiakim. The people were heavily taxed to pay tribute to the pharaoh. When Necho pushed northward towards the Euphrates, he was met by a Babylonian army under command of Prince Nebuchadrezzar. The Egyptians were routed at Carchemish in 605 B.C. In 604 B.C. Nabopolassar died, and the famous Nebuchadrezzar II ascended the throne of Babylon. He lived to be one of its greatest kings, and reigned for over 40 years. It was he who built the city described by Herodotus, and constructed its outer wall, which enclosed so large an area that no army could invest in it. Merodach's temple was decorated with greater magnificence than ever before. The great palace and hanging gardens were erected by this mighty monarch, who no doubt attracted to the city large numbers of the skilled artisans who had fled from Nineveh. He also restored temples at other cities, and made generous gifts to the priests. Captives were drafted into Babylonia from various lands and employed cleaning out the canals and as farm laborers. The trade and industries of Babylon flourished greatly, and Nebuchadrezzar's soldiers took speedy vengeance on roving bands which infested the caravan roads. The king of Egypt, after his crushing defeat at Carchemish, came not again any more out of his land, for the king of Babylon had taken from the river of Egypt unto the river Euphrates all that pertained to the king of Egypt. Jehoiakim of Judah remained faithful to Necho until he was made a prisoner by Nebuchadrezzar, who bound him in fetters to carry him to Babylon. He was afterwards sent back to Jerusalem, and Jehoiakim became his, Nebuchadrezzar's, servant 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. Bands of Chaldeans, Syrians, Moabites, and Ammonites were harassing the frontiers of Judah, and it seemed to the king as if the Babylonian power had collapsed. Nebuchadrezzar hastened westward and scattered the raiders before him. Jehoiakim died, and his son Jehoiachin, a youth of 18 years, succeeded him. Nebuchadrezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, and the young king submitted to him, and was carried off to Babylon with all the princes and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained save the poorest sort of the people of the land. Nebuchadrezzar had need of warriors and workmen. Zedekiah was placed on the throne of Judah as an Assyrian vassal. He remained faithful for a few years, but at length began to conspire with Tyre and Sidon, Moab, Edom, and Ammon in favor of Egyptian suzerainty. Pharaoh Hophra-Apries, the fourth king of the 26th dynasty, took active steps to assist the conspirators, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Nebuchadrezzar led a strong army through Mesopotamia and divided it at Riblah on the Orontes River. One part of it descended upon Judah and captured Lachish and Azekah. Jerusalem was able to hold out for about 18 months. Then the famine was sore in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. Then the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled, and went forth out of the city by night, by way of the gate between the two walls, which was by the king's garden. Zedekiah attempted to escape, but was captured and carried before Nebuchadrezzar, who was at Riblah in the land of Hamath. And the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then he put out the eyes of Zedekiah. And the king of Babylon bound him in chains, and carried him to Babylon, and put him in prison till the day of his death. The majority of the Jews were deported to Babylonia, where they were employed as farm laborers. Some rose to occupy important official positions. A remnant escaped to Egypt with Jeremiah. Jerusalem was plundered and desolated. The Assyrians burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem, and brake down all the walls of Jerusalem round about. Jeremiah lamented, "How doth the city sit solitary, that was full of people? How is she become as a widow, she that was great among the nations, and princess among the provinces? How is she become tributary? She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she hath none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction, and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen, she findeth no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between the straits. Jerusalem remembered in the days of her affliction, and of her miseries all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old." Tyre was besieged, but was not captured. Its king, however, arranged terms of peace with Nebuchadrezzar. Amel-Marduk, the evil Merodach of the Bible, the next king of Babylon, reigned for a little over 2 years. He released Jehoiachin from prison and allowed him to live in the royal palace. Berosus relates that Amel-Marduk lived a dissipated life and was slain by his brother-in-law Nergal-Shar-Utsur, who reigned 2 years, 559–560 B.C. Labashi-Marduk, son of Nergal-Shar-Utsur, followed with a reign of 9 months. He was deposed by the priest. Then a Babylonian prince named Nabonidus was set on the throne. He was the last independent king of Babylonia. His son, Belshazzar, appears to have acted as regent during the latter part of the reign. Nabonidus engaged himself actively during his reign, 556–540 B.C., in restoring temples. He entirely reconstructed the house of Shamash, the sun god, at Sippar, and towards the end of his reign, the house of Sin, the moon god, at Haran. The latter building had been destroyed by the Medes. The religious innovations of Nabonidus made him exceedingly unpopular throughout Babylonia, for he carried away the gods of Erech, Larsa, and Eridu, and had them placed in Esagila. Merodach and his priests were displeased. The prestige of the great god was threatened by the policy adopted by Nabonidus. As an inscription composed after the fall Babylon sets forth, Merodach gazed over the surrounding lands, looking for a righteous prince, one after his own heart, who should take his hands. He called by name Cyrus. Cyrus was a petty king of the shrunken Elamite province of Anshan, which had been conquered by the Persians. He claimed to be an Achaemenian, that is, a descendant of the semi-mythical Achaemenish, the Achaemenes of the Greeks, a Persian patriarch who resembled the Aryo-Indian Manu and the Germanic Manus. Achaemenish was reported to have been fed and protected in childhood by an eagle, the sacred eagle which casts its shadow on born rulers. Probably this eagle was remotely totemic, and the Achaemenians were descendants of an ancient eagle tribe. Gilgamesh was protected by an eagle, as we have seen, as the Aryo-Indian Shakuntala was by vultures, and Semiramis by doves. The legends regarding the birth and boyhood of Cyrus resemble those related regarding Sargon of Akkad and the Indian Karna and Krishna. Cyrus acknowledged as his overlord Astyages, king of the Medes. He revolted against Astyages, whom he defeated and took prisoner. Thereafter he was proclaimed king of the Medes and Persians, who were kindred peoples of Indo-European speech. The father of Astyages was Cyaxares, the ally of Nabopolassar of Babylon. When this powerful king captured Nineveh, he entered into possession of the northern part of the Assyrian Empire, which extended westward into Asia Minor to the frontier of the Lydian kingdom. He also possessed himself of Urartu, Armenia. Lydia had, after the collapse of the Sumerian power, absorbed Phrygia, and its ambitious king, Alyattes, waged war against the Medes. At length, owing to the good offices of Nebuchadrezzar of Babylon and Syenneses of Cilicia, the Medes and Lydians made peace in 585 B.C. Astyages then married a daughter of the Lydian ruler. When Cyrus overthrew Cyaxares, king of the Medes, Croesus, king of Lydia, formed an alliance against him with Amasis, king of Egypt, and Nabonidus, king of Babylon. The latter was at first friendly to Cyrus, who had attacked Cyaxares when he was advancing on Babylon to dispute Nabonidus's claim to the throne, and perhaps to win it for a descendant of Nebuchadrezzar, his father's ally. It was after the fall of the Median dynasty that Nabonidus undertook the restoration of the moon god's temple at Haran. Cyrus advanced westward against Croesus of Lydia, before that monarch could receive assistance from the intriguing but pleasure-loving Amasis of Egypt. He defeated and overthrew him and seized his kingdom, 547-546 B.C. Then, having established himself as supreme ruler in Asia Minor, he began to operate against Babylonia. In 539 B.C., Belshazzar was defeated near Opis. Sippar fell soon afterwards. Cyrus's general, Obrias, then advanced upon Babylon, where Belshazzar deemed himself safe. One night, in the month of Tammuz, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. On the 16th of Tammuz, the investing army under Gobryas entered Babylon, the gates having been opened by friends within the city. Some think that the Jews favored the cause of Cyrus. It is quite as possible, however, that the priests of Merodach had a secret understanding with the great Achaemenian, the king of kings. A few days afterwards Cyrus arrived at Babylon. Belshazzar had been slain, but Nabonidus still lived, and he was deported to Carmania. Perfect order prevailed throughout the city, which was firmly policed by the Persian soldiers, and there was no looting. Cyrus was welcomed as a deliverer by the priesthood. He took the hands of Bel-Merodach at Esagila, and was proclaimed King of the world, King of Babylon, King of Sumer and Akkad, and King of the four quarters. Cyrus appointed his son Cambyses as governor of Babylon. Although a worshipper of Ahura Mazda and Mitra, Cambyses appears to have conciliated the priesthood. When he became king and swept through Egypt, he was remembered as the madman who, in a fit of passion, slew a sacred Apis bull. It is possible, however, that he performed what he considered to be a pious act. He may have sacrificed the bull to Mitra. The Jews also welcomed Cyrus. They yearned for their native land. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. Cyrus heard with compassion the cry of the captives. Now in the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus king of Persia, The Lord God of heaven hath given me all kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God, which is in Jerusalem. In 538 B.C., the first party of Jews who were set free saw through tears the hills of home, and hastened their steps to reach Mount Zion. 50 years later, Ezra led back another party of the faithful. The work of restoring Jerusalem was undertaken by Nehemiah in 445 B.C. The trade of Babylon flourished under the Persians, and the influence of its culture spread far and wide. Persian religion was infused with new doctrines, and their deities were given stellar attributes. Ahura Mazda became identified with Bel-Merodach, as perhaps he had previously been with Ashur, and the goddess Anahita absorbed the attributes of Nina, Ishtar, Zerpanituᵐ, and other Babylonian mother deities. Another Semiramis came into prominence. This was the wife and sister of Cambyses. After Cambyses died, she married Darius I, who, like Cyrus, claimed to be an Achaemenian. He had to overthrow a pretender, but submitted to the demands of the orthodox Persian party to purify the Ahura Mazda religion of its Babylonian innovations. Frequent revolts in Babylon had afterwards to be suppressed. The Merodach priesthood apparently suffered loss of prestige at court. According to Herodotus, Darius plotted to carry away from Esagila a great statue of Bel, 12 cubits high and entirely of solid gold. He, however, was afraid to lay his hands upon it. Xerxes, son of Darius, 485 to 465 B.C., punished Babylon for revolting, when intelligence reached them of his disasters in Greece, by pillaging and partly destroying the temple. He killed the priest who forbade him to move the statue and took it away. The city lost its vassal king, and was put under the control of a governor. It, however, regained some of its ancient glory after the burning of Susa Palace, for the later Persian monarchs resided in it. Darius II died at Babylon, and Artaxerxes II promoted in the city the worship of Anaitis. When Darius III, the last Persian emperor, was overthrown by Alexander the Great in 331 B.C., Babylon welcomed the Macedonian conqueror as it had welcomed Cyrus. Alexander was impressed by the wisdom and accomplishments of the astrologers and priests, who had become known as Chaldeans, and added Bel-Merodach to its extraordinary pantheon, which already included Ammon of Egypt, Melkarth, and Jehovah. Impressed by the antiquity and magnificence of Babylon, he resolved to make it the capital of his world-wide empire, and there he received ambassadors from countries as far east as India and as far west as Gaul. The canals of Babylonia were surveyed, and building operations on a vast scale planned out. No fewer than 10,000 men were engaged working for 2 months reconstructing and decorating the temple of Merodach, which towered to a height of 607 feet. It looked as if Babylon were about to rise to a position of splendor unequaled in its history, when Alexander fell sick, after attending a banquet, and died on an evening of golden splendor sometime in June of 323 B.C. One can imagine the feelings of the Babylonian priests and astrologers as they spent the last few nights of the emperor's life reading the omens of the air, taking note of wind and shadow, moon and stars and planets, seeking for a sign, but unable to discover one favorable. Their hopes of Babylonian glory were suspended in the balance, and they perished completely when the young emperor passed away in the 33rd year of his life. For 4 days and 4 nights the citizens mourned in silence for Alexander and for Babylon. The ancient city fell into decay under the empire of the Seleucidae. Seleucus I had been governor of Babylon, and after the break-up of Alexander's empire he returned to the ancient metropolis as a conqueror. None of the persons who succeeded Alexander, Strabo wrote, attended to the undertaking at Babylon. The reconstruction of Merodach's temple. Other works were neglected, and the city was dilapidated partly by the Persians and partly by time, and through the indifference of the Greeks, particularly after Seleucus Nicator fortified Seleucia on the Tigris. Seleucus drafted to the city which bore his name the great bulk of the inhabitants of Babylon. The remnant which was left behind continued to worship Merodach and other gods after the walls had crumbled, and the great temple began to tumble down. Babylon died slowly, but at length the words of the Hebrew prophet were fulfilled. The cormorant and the bittern shall possess it, the owl also, and the raven shall dwell in it. They shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all her princes shall be nothing. And thorns shall come up in her palaces, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof. And it shall be an habitation of dragons, and a court for owls. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl also shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest. End of chapter 20. Recording by Leda Blair, North Mankato, Minnesota. End of Myths of Babylonia and Assyria by Alexander Mackenzie.